Most of us have a pretty fixed image of Jesus in our minds, whether it was the paintings in our Sunday school classes, or the Bible movies and television shows that we've watched, or the occasional Jesus bobblehead bouncing around on someone's dashboard. We've gathered a picture in our minds of what Jesus looks like and how he lived. But what if Jesus looked and lived differently than we even imagine? What if many of the things about Jesus were actually different than the stories we've been told or the scenes we've seen depicted? Well, over the next few minutes, I'm going to share with you 10 things that will change the way you see Jesus in this episode of Misreading Scripture. It's natural for us to assume that Jesus was just like us. Without even realizing it, we assume that the values and practices that we have must have been the same for Jesus. For instance, since we value people who can speak extemporaneously, we assume that Jesus must never have rehearsed a sermon. We support it with the theology that Jesus was all-knowing, so why would he even need to rehearse? But ultimately, that assumption itself comes from our belief that unrehearsed speech is more authentic and spirit-led and thus better. Well, in the same way, it's easy for us to assume that Jesus prayed this way, right? That Jesus' prayers were always off the cuff, from the heart. Since we consider such prayer more genuine, we assume that that's what Jesus must have practiced. But it wasn't, at least not all the time. There were a host of prayers and blessings that Jewish people would memorize at a young age and recite throughout each day. For instance, every day, a person would pray the Shema, a prayer found in chapter 6 of Deuteronomy. Or when Jesus teaches the Lord's Prayer, he's actually drawing upon traditional Jewish prayers called the 18 benedictions. And in moments like the feeding of the 5,000, the blessing that Jesus prays over the fish would have been a traditional blessing of food. It's not that Jesus didn't ever pray extemporaneously, or even thought that we shouldn't. But these traditional memorized prayers were an important part of Jewish culture, and Scripture shows us that Jesus embraced them. When most of us think of Jesus' family, we think of Mary and Joseph and maybe some random siblings or cousins that we don't know much about. But the truth is, Jesus likely had quite an extended family. We catch glimpses of many of them sporadically throughout the Gospels. And one of the things that we see is that some of these family members had concerns about Jesus. In Mark 3, we read that Jesus entered a house and the crowd gathered again so that they were not even able to eat. When his family heard this, they set out to restrain him because they said, "He's out of his mind." And then just a few verses later, Mark says, his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent word to him and called him. And he replied to them, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" Now, whatever is going on here, there is clearly some tension within Jesus' family. It could be that they're afraid of how Rome will react to some of the claims that Jesus has been making. Or it could be that they are in disbelief because they never saw evidence of these things when Jesus was growing up. It could be that they're just concerned about how their friends and others will handle all of this. But either way, while we might imagine that Jesus' family was perfect and peaceful, we can see that Jesus grew up with family dynamics not altogether different than the ones that most of us still face today. At the age of 6, Jewish boys began to attend school. This wasn't really optional. It was an expectation from within the community. While a boy would spend time learning his father's trade, this basic schooling was an essential and foundational part of Jewish life. At 6 years old, young boys would begin to attend a school called Beit Sefer. This means the house of the book. During Beit Sefer, young boys would memorize significant portions of Scripture. They would memorize large portions of Genesis and Deuteronomy, a variety of Psalms. And some scholars actually believe that in some cases, boys would memorize the entirety of the first 5 books of the Bible. Now, if you were incredibly gifted, you could move on to other levels of education, schools called Beit Talmud and Beit Midrash. But at the very least, you would attend Beit Sefer. Beit Sefer was a critical part of religious education because remember, the Israelite people's entire identity was rooted in their relationship with God. You couldn't truly understand what it meant to be Jewish without studying the Torah. And so, given the importance of this education within the Jewish community, Jesus would almost certainly have attended this school with his peers. He may have already known all the answers and, let's be honest, written the scriptures. But at this point, few people other than his parents truly knew that. So the community would have expected him to attend Beit Sefer. It was just that important within their culture. There was a practice among rabbis at the time of Jesus where a rabbi would quote a verse of scripture and expect that those listening could fill in the rest. Remember, there were no physical copies of scripture that people could carry around at that time. Scrolls were very special and were treated with great care. If you wanted to talk about scripture out and about in everyday life, you had to quote it from memory. Additionally, scripture wasn't divided into chapters and verses at that time. If you wanted to reference a scripture, you couldn't simply say, turn to Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 1 through 9. That didn't exist. You brought people's attention to a certain scripture by quoting it. And since rabbis expected that the men that they were talking to had gone through Beit Sefer, they expected that these men would be able to recall an entire passage just by hearing the first verse in that passage. In fact, we actually see Jesus implement this practice on multiple occasions. Right? For instance, on the cross, Jesus quotes Psalm 22, verse 1. But in doing so, he directs people's attention to that entire psalm, which reveals to his audience who he truly is and what is happening on the cross. He knew that they had memorized the scripture, and he knew that in order to teach this final lesson, all he needed to do was remind them of that one verse. When we think of Jesus' disciples, we often think of the 12 men named in the Gospels. But when we look closer, we actually see that Jesus had many more followers than that. In a variety of places, we see people other than the 12 refer to Jesus as rabbi or teacher. In Mark, we learn that Jesus chose his 12 disciples from among a much larger group. And in Luke, we see Jesus send out 72 people to cast out demons and heal the sick, students who will go do these works in his name as his representatives. So while the 12 still have a unique relationship with Jesus, his band of disciples actually expanded more broadly, which is further evidenced by our next fact, which is that Jesus had female disciples. When Jesus is visiting with Mary and Martha, we read that Mary was sitting at Jesus' feet. This was the traditional position of a disciple when they would sit and learn the teachings of a rabbi. A rabbi might be sitting on some cushions or some sort of makeshift seat, and the disciples would sit at his feet, ready to listen. And this included both men and women. We can see in ancient Jewish writings that women were not prohibited from being part of religious debate. Often, they were encouraged to be a part of it. Some women even had their words recorded in accounts of major Jewish debates. Many restrictions around the presence and the activity of women arose later, after Jesus. But as we can see in Scripture, for Jesus, having a woman among his students was completely acceptable. Just as Jesus went through the Jewish education system, he also would have been exposed to important Jewish rabbis of his time. In fact, two of the most significant rabbis of Jesus' age were Rabbi Hillel and Rabbi Shammai. Now, Hillel and Shammai had quite different approaches to the Torah. Shammai held a much more literal, conservative view of the commands of Scripture, and Hillel's views at that time were considered definitely more progressive. Since these views were held in such high regard at the time of Jesus, Jesus acquainted himself with their varying perspectives, ready for whenever they arose in conversation or debate. And arise they did. At one point, Jesus is asked directly which of these rabbis he agrees with on the topic of divorce. In Mark chapter 10, Jesus is presented with Hillel's interpretation of the law and made to say whether or not he agrees with it. Now, the answer that he gives is much more in line with the approach of Shammai. But in other moments, Jesus seems to be more in line with the school of Hillel, taking a more progressive stance. Either way, Jesus was clearly aware of both of these teachers and well-versed in their teachings. One of the things that most children can tell you about Jesus is that Jesus was a carpenter. We imagine him making chairs or building wooden houses. But Jesus' trade was very likely different than that. The word we often see translated carpenter in Scripture is the Greek word tekton. But tekton isn't just the word for a carpenter, it's also the word for a stonemason and other trades where a person uses his hands. Furthermore, one of the things that has been historically true about Israel is that there aren't naturally a lot of trees. In fact, there's actually a foundation set up to plant more trees in Israel. At the time of Jesus, people were much more likely to find rocks to work with than they were wood. Buildings were made of stone rather than constructed of lumber. So when we imagine Jesus, instead of picturing him with a saw and wooden planks, perhaps we should imagine him with a hammer and a chisel, ready to break open the side of a mountain or chisel away at an important vessel, still working with his hands, just in a different way than we thought. In every culture, we make decisions about what we consider appropriate and inappropriate. But what do we do when Jesus, our moral compass, seems to live differently than the values that we've established? I mean, this has at times been a concern when it comes to topics like alcohol and dancing. Did Jesus drink? Did he dance? And the answer to both of those is almost certainly yes. He did both of those things. Wine is present throughout Scripture and Jewish tradition. Wine was served at Passover. Jesus turned water into wine at a wedding in Cana. He also would have danced traditional Jewish dances at this wedding. He would have remembered how David danced before the Lord. None of this would have been odd or immoral to him. Aside from drunkenness and illicit forms of dancing, there was nothing prohibiting these practices broadly. These were common practices in the community to which he belonged. And there's really no reason to assume that he thought any differently. Often when we imagine Jesus, we imagine him wearing a white robe with long hair and a beard. But there's a good chance that Jesus looked quite different than the images we have in our minds. Right? There were several garments that were customary in the Jewish community, especially among rabbis, that Jesus almost certainly would have worn. For instance, Jesus certainly would have worn a talit. A talit is an outer garment with tassels on the corners. This garment was always worn in public and could double as a blanket at night. Underneath, a person would wear a haluk, which was a basic undergarment. Both of these are what Jesus is referring to when he says, "As for the one who wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat as well." He's saying, if they sue you for your haluk, give them your talit as well. We also see the talit in Matthew and Luke when the bleeding woman touches the end of Jesus' robe. This is most likely referring to the tassels of Jesus' talit. But Jesus also was likely wearing something that we don't often imagine, a tefillin. A tefillin is a small box containing scripture bound to a man's arm and head. In Deuteronomy 6:6-8, God commanded the Israelite people to wear this. It's hard to imagine that Jesus would have broken this command. Now, the kind of tefillin that Jesus wore might have looked different than what we see today, but there would have been a customary way to fulfill this scripture in the first century, and any religious leader would have been expected to follow it. So in the end, Jesus might have looked less like this and more like this. Certainly not what most of us imagine, but closer to the first century rabbi who would walk the earth for that short period of time before his death and resurrection changed the world and our lives forever. Well, that's it for this week. Thank you so much for watching. Now, if you enjoyed today's video, you'll definitely want to check out this other episode of Misreading Scripture. Now, until next time, thank you so much for watching. Have a great week, and God bless.